Right, we're joined by Sean Pillot de Chenecey, who at one point would have been, could have been one of the co-founders of the Future Laboratory.
Well, he was a co-founder.
It was a co-founder, and actually then went on.
The third leg.
Went on to do. Well, you've done post-truth business, you've done influencers and revolutionaries. You also ran Captain Crikey, famously. I remember trying to explain what you did, and the person, so he works in covert operations, military emphasis, and now actually you've gone on to do Brand Positive, which is really about, I guess, looking at how brands could behave after COVID, so the new normal and what happens next. Is that a good summary or not? Or am I missing something?
Done. There we are. Where do I sign?
Perfect. See, so really what I was keen on is you probably more than anybody we've spoken to are active and more aware of what's happening in the past and the last 20 years. So if you could kind of tell me what you think the 20 years has been like for you in terms of business, and ignoring what's happening in the background with Chris collecting posts from Amazon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, fair enough. Okay, I mean, as an instant sort of mini run to the last 20 years, and what I think has been absolutely fascinating has been, where do we start? Way back in 2000, Francis Fukuyama, the end of history. Remember that? Nothing happened. It had all happened, and therefore we could all basically relax and get on with it. And then reality happened, as sort of John Lennon would say. And hasn't it been an extraordinary ride over the last 20 years for all of us? I mean, to me, one of the many things one could look at has been the way that where we were back in 2000, when quite frankly, London and New York ruled the world from the point of view of, if you say, the futurist community. What I think is really, really interesting is the way that it's now finally, broadened out everywhere, which I think is absolutely fascinating. Meanwhile, what I think is really, really quite extraordinary is that on your Epic Future Lab site, you say that you're one of the world's most renowned futures consultancies, which I think is incredibly self-effacing. If there's any other futures consultancy out there that want to put themselves in the #1 place, then bring it on, and we can all watch and listen to the derision they get given as people they get laughed out of town. So I think it's been an incredibly interesting ride over the last 20 years. But from the point of view of the Future Lab, well done. It's been really, really interesting and inspiring to watch what you've done.
I mean, I think it's also good, and I was thinking about this, that with the people you collaborate with, and you will know this because, as you said, in the early years, for everybody involved in forecasting, futurism, or looking at foresight, which is now the new word to replace the old word of forecasting, in some ways it was lonely convincing businesses that you actually could do this job correctly and properly. And I think the partnering, if I think about you working with people, us working with people, you've had, Annalisa, you've had, people like William Hyam, you had the Futures consultancy as it changed its name 3 times. But interestingly, everybody forged what I think is a collective pathway and almost a conviction route for businesses to understand that actually this is quite legitimate and quite a powerful way. And also, I think, increasingly a good way to plan options for the future. You're not really predicting. You're saying that here are the numerous pathways you could have. Which one do you think is going to work best? And which one actually is more favorable to also other people around you? So I think that's probably quite a good thing to learn. Do you think there's been a negative side to the proliferation of kind of forecasters and futurists and scenario planners? And
yeah, sure. I think very clearly there's been a real negative side to the world of forecasting and all of its in many sort of vagaries, should we say? And I think that's the key point. It's the vagaries of it. I mean, way back in, let's say, sort of the mid to late 90s, when you guys used to talk about this in great detail. Quite frankly, there was no one else out there. There was no agency, certainly in the tragic world of advertising, there wasn't a features department out there. There was no one with a trend title. That was very, very much essentially in the world of academia, in terms of the more interesting, forward-looking universities, and then also obviously in the world of think tanks. Which tended to be more obviously of the sort of political forecasting or sort of militaristic variety, should we say. Meanwhile, I mean, what have we seen since then? Straight after 2000, when you set up, I think what we see fairly soon after that was the combat-clad web designer Nathan Barley zooming around Hoxton, and of course at that point all bets were off. And so I think Mr. Barley really coincided with the explosion of trend analysts and all the rest of it, as so superbly pastiched in comedies like 2020, etc., which really took the entire thing apart. So
remember that term cool hunting? Do you remember that? It was that I was rereading Tipping Point, with Malcolm Gladwell, and I was thinking actually at the time you had people selling cool hunting services, which always seemed, even as you say the word, sounds spurious and made up. And the way that Nathan Barley's that whole world he had was both concocted, but also weirdly became believable. I'm also thinking of the agency that created Normcore, how it was done purely as a recreational joke with a nod towards, doing it like a live art installation. Yeah. And actually Normcore became quite a legitimate fashion trend for people like Gap, who were obviously desperate to get anything that they could stick their rather beige and no hope fashions against, and suddenly Normcore. And I just think there is a bit of the industry which still is very much about having a stab at two words you pull together randomly and hoping that, wow, okay, they will come up with, like, for example, experience medicine, which we coined yesterday as a joke, and then I heard somebody else using it as a serious term to present a client with a new proposition about wellness and medicine sitting together.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's been also one of the issues of the approaches and the business models put together by the trend agencies, by the trend consultancies in their sort of legion type amounts, and that has been that they all have, the amount of people who have basically taken the approach of think of some, as you say, spurious hashtag and then bolt some quasi facts onto it has been completely obvious. It's being done anywhere and everywhere by everyone in the sector. Those who are actually doing it properly, with a sense of depth, with rigor, with something to back it up, with the ability to stand your ground and explain why it is that this scenario, this viewpoint, this angle,
it's going to happen. Yeah.
Jittering, I think is increasingly rare. So it's very, very problematic, to put it mildly.
But unpacking the relationship between brand and, how best to put it, the support industries that surround the brand relationship in a little bit more detail. How do you think some of those relationships have changed over the last 20 years in terms of the way that brands engage with consultancies or agencies or that whole plethora that we the piranha pool that we both swim in? How do you think that's changed and altered over the last 20 years?
I think probably the biggest thing that springs to mind in terms of what's really altered over the last 20 years has been the absolute lack of confidence in adland. And so 20 years ago, the ad industry and the advertising sector were without doubt the kings and queens, if you like, of the entire sort of marketing services area, if you like. Everyone just laughed at PR agencies and design agencies were the last ones to be considered for anything.
Yeah.
Haven't they had the last laugh? So, PR more vital than ever. The role of the designer, thankfully, it has been, again, finally actually sort of viewed with the respect that the world of design and design thinking has always required. Meanwhile, there seems to be just a real lack of confidence in adland. And so I think that really became apparent nearly a decade ago, when the amount of ad agencies who were quickly scraping the words advertising off the plinths or whatever above the door, and describing themselves as comms agencies or anything but advertising.
Engagement companies, yeah.
It's funny, isn't it? Because in essence, what's happened is that where previously we would backload the spend, which is that an ad agency would get all of the cash in order to solve the problem and just push the product that final few yards in front of the nose of the consumer. That spend, well, I don't think that spend yet has got to the point where it's being front loaded, which is where most of us would argue it should be, which is that you actually spend and invest the money to better understand your customer before you even start thinking about designing the product. So you can actually anticipate need and design according to that, and then research, innovate, and then deliver. But maybe it has got a little bit more evenly spread across the process.
Sure, and I think the other massive thing is obviously that there's the world of short-termism, in many ways linked to social media, which again, effectively 20 years ago was nothing like obviously what it is now. And so I think that's one of the things that has obviously supercharged the point of view from the marketing departments, which has tended to become ever more, again, nervous and ever more short-termist. And you'll see people like, the mighty Mark Ritson will talk about this a lot, that, there's obviously a need for hitting your quarterly targets, but the lack of genuine long-term brand building, genuine brand strategy going on is a real concern.
Yeah.
It's not this positive. Short-termism is causing massive problems across the board.
I mean, it was interesting. I was reading a piece in Fortune recently about the number of VCs who are coming in. So they see a brand, the brand is making money, they invest in it, but the first thing they do, they strip away the intangible assets of the brand, because they can't measure it on a spreadsheet. And what they inadvertently do, they are stripping away the value of the brands. What the Fortune was saying is that a brand instills 30% increase in overall value. So if you have a generic product and you create a brand and then you market that brand well, it uplifts the value by 30%. But these guys come in, they can't really see that. They don't understand the power of brand. They understand the power of product and all of that sits around it. And systematically, they looked at 10 years of investment and where they stripped it out to create different synergies. And it was without a doubt on the brand, the creative, what they call the poetic equity was the phrase they used to describe it. And I kind of feel that in some ways with forecasting and with foresight and the work you do, a lot of the time you're having to look at the intangible issues, because there are a lot of things that sit inside the customer's head that are not necessarily visible. You're then having to translate that into a tangible mechanism that makes it valuable to the brand you're dealing with, and that's the value that takes the brand forward, not just an investment in infrastructure. It's an investment in what I call future structure, that your thinking in their head fuels that growth. And yet, a lot of people still will not recognize that as a value because you can't sit it on the balance sheet. I mean, what's your thoughts from where you are now to where, you worked in agency world, you've now worked with clients a lot. What would you say to them to think about for the next 20 years? Where should they place their kind of bets and their investment?
Well, I think taking a view in the next 20 years is something I'd back to yourselves, but I'd say taking a view on the next couple of years is something that I would sort of be more comfortable talking about. And naturally, in terms of the here and now and the truly extraordinary year that we've all gone through, no matter which of your clients around the world are watching this presentation and are joining in with this celebration of your 20th. It's obviously been unbelievable. Quite frankly, all bets are off. If you look at views from everywhere, from people like yourselves to leading titles like the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Economist, etc., there'll be sort of key things people are talking about in terms of things like impact on supply chains, issues of growth of megacorp. Again, this issue of short-termism. But I think one of the key points that we can all safely say has been really, really apparent for brands in this extraordinary era is the power of integrity and the way that brand behavior is really what brands are all about. And so as we are, back end of 2020, when we look back and see the brands that have really been noted this year, the brands that people have actually spoken about, and as we all know, people actually talking about brands is incredibly rare. Most people just don't care. Most people just aren't interested. They have noted, they have been interested, and they have thought of brands that have looked around them and have thought about the role that they can play in society, that have finally, to use those dreaded words, given something back, have stood up to be counted. I think that's been really, really interesting, how, all those things that people like yourselves have been talking about for years in terms of
citizen brands.
Exactly, citizen brands. The behavior is the brand, that brand reality. This year, it's come to pass. So I think that's really, really fascinating. And so those brands that have actually stood up to be counted, done something useful, have actually built some genuine brand trust, have put themselves into a very strong position for the next, certainly, as you say, 20 years. Whereas those who have just droned on, as ever, just chucking more and more landfill advertising out there, why?
And I mean, it is shocking in some ways to see that we were looking at recently about, where 87%, this was just one of those throwaway facts, really, 87% of businesses now have a purpose statement, which goes great, but then you get the only 83%, sorry, a shocking 83% of businesses still have not looked at what that purpose means within their business. So while they've got something that sits there on paper, and I thought that was the interesting thing, that in some ways now you can see why, kind of mid-20s millennials, but certainly Gen Z, are reacting badly against the P word. They're finding the whole word, they're talking about purpose washing in the way that we spoke about greenwashing. Yeah. And just your kind of thoughts on that before you get to ask us a question is, do you think purpose is genuine, or is it yet another attempt to sit on the good side of marketing, and it's therefore just cynical, and when that shifts, brands will be off it? Or do you think really they are trying to be committed and to get on and do better for themselves and the planet? What's your thoughts on that?
I think for the vast majority of brands, the vast majority of businesses and organizations that talk about purpose, what they've really been doing is effectively taken, say, to use the analogy of the oil company, bunging a few cents or pence or whatever, or euros to the blind children's orphanage, sticking that in the front cover of the annual report, and meanwhile, bang, off we go, let's buy a new yacht and, let's melt some ice, and few seals, at the annual party. Very, very few brands have actually just stood up to be counted and done something meaningful. I think one of the key things is brands doing something meaningful that is relevant to the brand itself, that actually therefore has some sort of a core resonance behind it. And I think that brands that have actually not just gone down the route of making tragic films as everyone sobs watching a sort of a polar bear looking for some solid ice, but actually instead doing something to do something about climate change has been, or the climate crisis has been extraordinary. And of course that again is one of the other crucial things that again people like yourselves were talking about 20 years ago. Are you presenting about it back at the back end of the 90s and early 2000s about this crucial issue of the climate crisis, ecological emergency, and people tended to kind of go, whatever, get on with it, slightly tragic, save the world. Now, finally, obviously, unfortunately, the realization that this isn't a trend issue, but is a real life, super important, vital, existential issue is one that you were talking about 20 years ago. You were right then and you're right now.
Interestingly, I was working with one of the brands that we're engaged with at the moment yesterday and talking to the CEO, and they're Europe's largest provider of white goods. And this year they, as a business, went carbon neutral. And he's passionate about climate change. And it was very refreshing to hear him speak, but also to just throw his arms up in bewilderment at other brands or companies of a similar size to his. And obviously, if you're Europe's largest provider of white goods, you're pretty big. Yeah. Where they're still talking about a policy that might be in 2030 or 2050.
Yeah, you put it on the long
and he's just kind of going, we've gone a step of the way in that we're now carbon neutral, but we've actually got to be carbon positive. So, and that's the shift that they're seeing. Before I've got one more question I certainly want to ask you, sort of again looking back before maybe we look forwards, which is there must be, I'm sure you've got some memories over the last 20 years of examples where with your work with your client, because it's so difficult in the way that we engage with clients to be actually able to put your finger on something that you have done and see the logical step through to the inevitability of a strategic change or product result. But are there things that you can think of where you've been instrumental in reversing, altering, changing, or where you can see the positive outcome and influencing the outcome in what you would regard as a positive way?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to me, I think a thing that I would personally be proud of, if one can use that as a word, and here we go, so just hang me some rope so I can sort of so to me, I think the really interesting thing is I use two words. First, authenticity. Now, authenticity was something that everyone was talking about, certainly when I joined the industry many years ago. People have been using the term constantly ever since, and I find it astonishing to this day. It seems that virtually nobody actually pauses and thinks about what they're talking about when they say the word authenticity. Most people seem to have no idea what it actually means, what the resonance is behind it, what the background is behind it. People tend to use the term and then move swiftly on. So to me, in terms of my first book, The Post-Truth Business, when I just unpacked that and just talked about authenticity from the perspective of there's like Wittgenstein or Aristotle or Rousseau or Kant or Nietzsche, etc., is to me a really, really interesting issue, because it still amazes me, say, how people use this most enragingly banal in many ways, and yet nobody actually pauses to think what it is, along with the other word or name that everyone uses in every presentation that any of us have ever been to, and that is Patagonia. What I think is fascinating about Patagonia in this context is that everyone at every conference or workshop or ideation session, whatever it is, people always go, let's think of a great example of a fantastic brand, and you know exactly what they're going to say. Everyone goes, Patagonia, aren't they brilliant? Everyone goes, absolutely. Damn it! I wish I was about to say that, because that was the first slide I was going to show. But the extraordinary thing is that then afterwards you go, okay, so we all agree at this conference, all 1,000 of us, as it used to be, 6 of us now, we all agree that they're absolutely amazing. Who is actually going to do anything that basically does something that they're going to do? Or who is there any other brand in the world that actually is as 360, if you like, as Patagonia is, in terms of the complete way they've structured that business, the way they act on the strategic, tactical basis. So everyone talks about them. Nobody actually then goes ahead.
Well, it's I guess you're setting, it's that classic thing where it's like the construction industry, one of the few industries that will absolutely follow a minimal acceptable standard of doing something. And I always go, imagine in fashion or culture, you decided that that's all we're going to do is a minimum standard. And I think that's the problem. A lot of businesses, while they would like to do better, are happy to do minimal, because minimal means you can get on, get through the law, keep some people happy, but at the end of the day, you're not really changing the fucking planet. You're not at all doing it.
I've got to rush.
Cool.
Thank you.
Sorry, Chris is usually on to the next thing before he's done the last thing.
It's not my fault. I'm being double booked.
Yeah, he's been double booked. Sorry, Sean. To your point, because I think we had this ongoing, there was words like authenticity, provenance, artisanal, heritage, were those great terms. And we did, I think you looked at this as well, but we said, actually, we are now so kind of overusing these things. It's like when people talk about we're a sustainable business. I had a recent encounter with somebody from the tobacco industry who proudly said they were a sustainable tobacco company because they were now growing organic leaves and they were paying a fair wage, and they had looked after their people in COVID. And this man was seriously wearing a mask while he was chatting to me. And I thought, oh my gosh, COVID is less likely to kill you than cancer. And here you are not really understanding the bigger issues. I mean, do you think there is a kind of a time of reckoning now for where we won't tolerate businesses putting things on the long finger? And, because you've got calling out of the mode, you've got shaming, you've got no platforming, you've got cancelling. So suddenly there's a lot of mechanisms at the consumer's control that they can use to target businesses or people. Do you think that will make a difference to how businesses behave, or will they just continue doing the same things behind closed doors? I mean, what's your kind of thoughts on that?
I think a lot of businesses will, as they always do, continuing doing things behind closed doors. At the same time, or should say sort of parallel to that or whatever, as we all know, again, one of the enormously beneficial things from a societal point of view over the last 20 years since Future Lab got going has been the growth of the all-seeing eye of the media, the ever-dwindling ability of brands and organizations to hide dubious activity, the rise of the citizen journalist, etc., etc. So the ability of brands to hide is ever smaller, thankfully. Still keep on trying to do precisely that. Again, we can just look around and see, only whatever, sort of a few short weeks ago, we saw, senior figures at VW being arrested. And it still beggars belief that brands and organizations of that size can be thinking they can get away with things. From the point of view, perhaps on that side, if the crime is big enough, no one will actually notice. So I think it's very interesting how they've been caught out, and no doubt there are many more senior execs busy sort of
Isn't it odd then, just as a kind of a final thought of this? I was thinking the other day how, we started, and I almost fell into this trap of starting to talk about, well, as people become more and more disenfranchised with business, they are looking to brands to provide them with guidance and a pathway and an ethical framework. And I'm like, God, that's like looking to the worst kind of criminal and fraudster to provide your children with some ethical, pathway that they can live as good citizens. And I'm just wondering, why is it because brands are so effective at conning us that they have convinced us that they are the natural inheritors of the kind of moral framework that we need to inhabit? Or is it that we are so lacking in real curiosity and in questions and challenges that we are missing the bigger point, that these things are just there to make money, they're not there to save the planet?
Sure, I think people absolutely realise that brands are there to make money, that corporates are there to do precisely that. However, there is, as any psychologist will tell us, there's a need for stability. There's a yearning for stability, and in particularly, again, in a year like the one we've just been living through, where the sort of the desire for a stable world, which obviously has never really been there, but we managed to convince ourselves that it was quite stable, has been, obviously that sort of a mirage has been shown for what it is. And so, meanwhile, as the reaction from most governments has been chaotic, and the reaction from most certainly famous politicians, with the exception of the spectacular activity put together by, obviously, Jittering in New Zealand. What have we basically seen? I think there is that situation whereby, and again, over the last 20 years, with the collapse of many institutions, or the collapse in trust in many institutions, being mirrored by an ever dwindling trust in brands, well, that if you like, that bit of trust has got to go somewhere. That yearning for trust has got to go somewhere. Again, hence, when we talk about reputation capital, from the point of view of, are brands or organizations or people trustworthy, reliable and competent, then some organisations, some brands have been trustworthy,
right, okay,
competent. And so therefore, I think those people have retained or gained our trust, and good, they deserve it, and they will benefit as a result.